Okay, hi everyone. Thank you very much for being here. For me, it's an honor to be able to talk to you today about mindset. Um, sorry. There we go. Okay. so, so I will be talking about. I will be reflecting on mindset. John Bergman just talked about the importance of mindset shift. So today I will be focusing particularly on how we need to really reflect on what we're doing on our teaching and make some important changes, which are not as easy as one would think. So I want to start with this song. This is one of my favorite songs from the Beatles. And, well, the Beatles also have reflected on mindset. So I want you to keep in mind, I will be using a lot of analogies about rain and shine and weather to talk about mindset. And we'll go back to reflecting on this song as well. All right, so let's get started with, what is mindset? And the first thing is that mindset is an ocean of beliefs that we have. That range from what we believe about learning, what we believe about teaching, what we believe about how we communicate, our emotions, mental health, what we believe about ourselves, what we believe about others. And these have a direct connection with the decisions that we make and eventually the actions that we take as educators and as people. So mindset has a huge impact on everything that we decide to do inside and outside the classroom and in our lives. But why am I talking about mindset? Well, basically, I've had this journey of a pedagogical journey. So I started out with flipped learning, and as John Bergman mentioned, I had a mindset shift. And in this mindset shift, I learned about a concept called growth mindset, which made me reflect a lot about how I'm teaching, what I'm doing, what I need to change in my practices, in my classes. And this led me to research about flipped learning and eventually research about growth mindset. So let me just mention a little bit about this research. Here you're seeing a picture of my research team at Universidad de los Andes. We're part of the bilingualism and multilingualism research group, and we designed a course for educators, for public school teachers in Colombia, about mindset, about growth mindset. So we taught them what this mindset is, what are the implications, what strategies they could use in their classes. And, well, we found a couple of very, very interesting results. But I think the biggest one is the one that's connected to communication. So one key finding is that communication was the characteristic that teachers reported having a change on. So they basically told us through the interviews that when they reflected about how they were communicating with their students and how their mindsets had an effect on the way that they communicated with their students, it clicked, right? They had this aha moment and they started making changes. So I'll be going back to talking about communication, but this is the direct connection that I'm making with mindset. And so I want to tell you about Carol Dweck's work. She coined two terms. So when we talk about mindset, Carol Dweck says, okay, everybody has two types of mindsets. You could have a fixed mindset or you could have a growth mindset. They really depend on how you believe intelligence or qualities can change or will stay fixed, right? Something important here to clarify is that when we talk about the growth mindset, it's not about just believing that you can change or believing that your abilities can grow. It's actually putting in the work. It's putting in the hard work, it's knowing the strategies, it's persevering and dedicating the time to make that mindset shift. She also mentions 5 situations where these two mindsets tend to appear. One of them is criticism, followed by challenges, success of others, obstacles, and efforts. And I want to give you a couple of examples of how we talk to ourselves, like our self-talk, can also reflect our mindset. So when we talk about criticism, I would like to ask you, do you take information as an opportunity for growth? Do you evaluate your errors? Or when you receive criticism, do you feel threatened and try to avoid them? So this is where we start noticing these two mindsets. In terms of challenges, do challenges excite you? Or do they freak you out and make you uncomfortable? Do you try to seek challenges, to find new ways and new opportunities, or do you avoid them completely? So there we can also see these two mindsets. Regarding success of others, do you feel inspired by other people's success, or do you feel threatened? Obstacles. Do you believe you still don't have what you need, but you could work on it, or do you just give up? And finally, in terms of effort, do you strongly believe that effort and hard work are important for learning, or do you just think it's a waste of time? So these are some examples of how the two minds appear in these 5 situations. And it's important to keep in mind that when we talk about mindset, it's not that one person has one type of mindset or another type of mindset. We have both types of mindset, and they appear in different situations, right? So here we have a couple of examples of what we could tend to say to ourselves, right? I'm not good at drawing, for example. Or in terms of personality, you could have a fixed thought like, I'm a bad-tempered person, instead of believing that you could work on your personality and change, right? So here you see the analogy with a garden, because our minds have all these thoughts mixed together. So sometimes a fixed mindset thought appears, sometimes a growth mindset thought appears, and they tend to appear in different moments, different situations. It's not really a black and white type of thing. But we know with neuroplasticity that anyone can actually learn, that we can create neural paths of anything that we would like to learn. We just have to work on it. We have to persevere. We have to use the strategies, right? Like our brain does grow. That's something that science tells us. And that's something that, well, gives us the basis to believe that there is that possibility of a mindset shift. But keep in mind that catching your fixed thoughts is tough. They are like passing clouds, okay? You can't just catch them easily. It's a process, and you have to work on it. And when you're able to catch them, well, then you can start making those shifts one step at a time. Regarding research, and I gave you the example of I can't draw. I actually thought I couldn't draw. I had that fixed thought in my head for many, many years. And then through doing all this work that I've been doing, I started learning how to draw. So here you're seeing an example of just a little piece of a sketch note. And I've highlighted 2 key aspects that I want you to focus on that Carol Dweck has mentioned about research that's been done. And it is that the growth mindset will not flourish, will definitely not flourish if you're in a fixed mindset setting. And that's something that, if we're in an educational culture where everyone, people say this is how it's been done. Why change if things work this way? It's going to be very tough for an educator to move forward with that growth mindset, right? So that's something that they found in the literature. And the other thing is that teachers, we have a huge responsibility, and we could support or we could cut off mindset growth. So whatever decision we take as educators, when we're conscious that these mindsets exist, are going to have a huge impact. They have a huge impact when we're not conscious that they exist. So that's one of the ideas that I want to leave you with. So let me tell you a little bit about my mindset journey. I've divided my journey in 2. One of them is my learning journey. So I want to show you this learning curve. And I am absolutely sure that we've all had a steeper curve than the one I'm showing you here, right? Through pandemic, we all had to learn how to do so many things we were not prepared for. So the learning curve was steep, but it was always followed with feedback. And I will mention a little, I'll mention some specific examples a little later, but the curve was always followed with feedback. I always asked for feedback, and this is what allowed me to continue my path and continue, climbing that very, very steep learning mountain. The other thing I want to talk about is emotional growth, and I want to ask you to do something, and it is to look at this. Sorry. I want you to, it seems, there we go, okay. So I want you to look at this mood meter, and this mood meter is taken from the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, and I want you to think, what emotions did you have during pandemic? Or what emotions have you had? Because some countries are already getting out of it, but some other countries, we're still here. We're still in confinement. So I just wanted to take a moment and kind of pinpoint what these emotions are for you, okay? All right, and I want to share with you what it is that I did with in my process. So what I did was that I chose 3 because I noticed that when I was circling these emotions, there were a whole bunch of emotions that I felt in the process. So these are the main ones. I chose 3 for each of the quadrants, and you'll see that there's a level of pleasantness, like from left to right, like least pleasant to most pleasant. And I marked, well, in all the quadrants because definitely there was a lot of emotions going on. So it's very interesting to see that in this confinement and in reflecting about my own emotions and my own beliefs about emotions, I couldn't pinpoint a specific quadrant. I couldn't say, high level of energy, it was always on red, or high level of energy always in the yellow quadrant. I was all around, and I'm sure many of you felt this way too. So I guess to conclude in terms of my emotional journey, it was a rainbow. It was full of many, many emotions. And, well, I guess we're still in that process of learning how to regulate our emotions and deal with them. And I will talk about some strategies and some of these reflections that I've had with mindset throughout this year. So I divided my reflections on mindset in 4 specific categories. So you'll see them here. So I will talk a little bit about flipped learning, my teaching beliefs, emotions, of course, and self-care and growth. So let's get started with flipped learning. In terms of flipped learning, so the pandemic hit, and it was this huge thunderstorm we weren't ready for, right? And I think many of us as educators didn't really have that umbrella ready to kind of cover ourselves in the thunderstorm. But my biggest reflection was that for me, content was the least of my concerns. I have been flipping for almost 7 years, and when the pandemic hit and I had to stay home and I had to, basically move on to virtual learning, I already had all the content ready because it was flipped. So I had videos, I had podcasts, I had infographics, I had a lot of content already set for my classes. The biggest challenge was actually thinking, how could I move the face-to-face activities into the virtual classroom, right? But the content was not an issue, and I think many educators who flip will tell you this. It was their transition into the pandemic was not as tough because we already had a lot of resources that we could work with thanks to this approach. So I just want to share with you 2 things that I had to challenge myself with in terms of content. One of them was to start gamifying my content because, as I mentioned, I've flipped content for 7 years. So I've done videos, I've worked on infographics, I've designed presentations. And something that was new for me was to start thinking of how to include gamification in the process. So what you're looking at here is an example of a gamified like rooms that I use to teach perspective and stance. And I did this using the tool Genially. And so this became a very big challenge and a big shift in how we tend to teach classes in a face-to-face setting versus using virtual. Another thing that has been a huge takeaway for me is flipping class summaries. So usually we teach a class, and the next day we'll tell students, last class we learned about this type of vocabulary. We learned about, this grammar topic or, whatever topic we were teaching. And I started just being very constant in writing, after I finished every class, writing a short summary of what we had done. So this really helped my students and helped them feel included, being able to go back to this content without needing me to repeat it all the time. Another aha moment was that differentiation is no longer a choice. I used to think it was a choice to start differentiating and to find ways to include students. Like I thought I had more time to think about it, to learn about it. And in the pandemic, I realized it's not a choice. We all need to differentiate. And I started doing this in a couple of ways. I'll just share a couple. One of them was flipping instructions. In that QR code, you can actually have access to my blog, where I've written a step-by-step of the process of how to flip instructions. And this was just a simple thing that allowed my students to always know what they had to do, how much time they had, what roles they played in the process, what task, what rules, etc. So this was a huge game changer that I will not stop using even after I'm in face-to-face settings. And another one was including more activities that require choice. So here there's two examples. A choice board of cause and effect, giving students the opportunity to decide how they want to see the explanation, right? How they want to plan and how they want to present. So the big challenge was, how could I provide choice but also evaluate using a checklist or using a rubric that will maintain the key criteria regardless of the type of mode they've chosen to use. So that's one. And the other one is paths. So I teach about flipped learning, and I've told my students, you know what? Choose a path. What do you want to do? You want to teach, you want to design a game, you want to design a comic, you want to design a video, etc. So this has been a huge change in my teaching, and I'm still working on it, but I think it's worth it. It's not a choice anymore. Differentiation is not a choice. So to conclude, in regards to flipped learning, it was a lifesaver. It was a lifesaver as an educator, and if you have not started flipping your classes, I am absolutely sure that when you start doing it, even if it's just flipping instructions, you will immediately recognize what the benefits of flipping are. And well, it was a huge, huge, huge lifesaver in this pandemic. I also want to share with you some of my teaching beliefs. I had a lot of shifts in my teaching beliefs, but there were very particular ones that stood out. So I'm just going to mention those. One of them, and I think we all saw this discussion, was, what's going on with students? Why aren't they turning on their cameras? And then a lot of beliefs came with this, with what we were thinking, and a lot of actions came with what we were thinking. So while I was during the pandemic, I read a lot of articles, I had a lot of discussions with educators, and there were just so many different ideas and actions being taken that I decided to ask my students. So I want to share with you what my students said. I asked them directly, why don't you turn on your camera? Like, what's going on? And they surprised me because it has nothing to do with the teacher, at least with what my students responded to this question. It has to do more with how they feel with themselves. Some students just don't like to see themselves in camera. They get distracted. They prefer to turn it off so they could focus on the teacher, right? Of course, this depends on the platform you're using. Some students are just extremely shy. So if they turn on the camera, they're not going to talk. Like, it's easier for them if you're not looking at me and I'm not looking at myself. I'm going to be able to communicate better in my classes. Some students openly told me, you know what, I just don't like how my face looks. I mean, I don't feel comfortable looking at myself, so I prefer to turn off the camera, right? Or there were days I didn't even take a shower, or I was like in my pajamas and I just left the camera off. So this really got me thinking regarding that discussion of should we ask them to turn it on or off? And of course, you can imagine I let them turn it on if they want to, and if they don't, I don't fill myself with misconceptions about why this is going on. Another confrontation I had in my own teaching was because there was a lot of planning going on. There are some lessons you think are awesome. This is like the best lesson, and we get into that fixed mindset of believing that things are perfect or should be perfect or are going to work, or the opposite, right? We might think this is just absolutely terrible. And again, remember that learning curve that I showed you, followed by feedback? Everything that I tried that was like a big lesson, I asked for feedback. So I just want to give you one example. I used an app. This app is called Remind. It's kind of like a WhatsApp. It's a communication tool for educators or for education. And I asked my students directly, hey, what did you think about this activity? Sometimes I did it through the app. Sometimes I did it in person. And students gave me their feedback. So instead of me, moping, oh my God, I think this activity was terrible and I failed, I read their comments. I was like, no, hey, I didn't fail. Actually, some students liked it, some didn't like it. And I think that's the basis of confronting our own beliefs. And don't just stay with your belief. Ask students, ask your colleagues, ask people to give you feedback, right? Okay. And an aha moment, and this one's very recent, regarding the whole, students who never turn on their cameras. Like, what do we think about these students that we never see, right? I mean, they might have turned on their camera once, and then we don't see them again. And this semester, students surprised me. And I have a message from a student that I received for Teachers' Day. And if I'm honest, I thought I would have received messages from students who always turn on their cameras, because as a teacher, I feel more connected to them because I'm looking at them, right? But I actually received more messages from students who never turn on their cameras. And even though I might not feel as connected because I don't see their faces, they do feel connected to me as an educator. And this was just mind-blowing. I couldn't believe it. And again, it was a shift in the beliefs that I have about what is or what isn't, or what we think happens when students are just not showing themselves. And so there's a couple of strategies that I want to highlight. And the big idea here is that we need to treat our thoughts as theories. Whatever we're thinking, whatever that belief is, we should treat it as a theory, okay? We shouldn't get fixed in, it is what I think it is, if we're not getting feedback, if we're not confronting the information. So treat it as theories. How can you do this? Well, I make the connection with Brené Brown's work. She suggests a strategy that is, the story I'm telling myself is. So she says, it's very different for you to say, for example, oh, my class was horrible, I'm a horrible teacher, versus the story I'm telling myself is that my class is horrible. So there you convert it into a theory, and then you could start confronting it, right? And this also connects with what Coates says about avoiding telling ourselves self-limiting stories. So here, there's a connection with communication, and it's self-talk. How we communicate with ourselves has a direct impact on the decisions we make and the actions as well. So, big conclusion, we shouldn't assume anything, and we should be asking for feedback, hopefully with a growth mindset. And I just want to show you an example of something I'm doing that's working very well, and it's something I've called commented feedback. And what I do is that I use a Padlet, and I ask my students, what do you like, what do you dislike, recommendations, do you have any comments, right? So they write this, and they do this anonymously. And then in class, I comment them. So I tell them, okay, I'm going to show you your feedback. Nobody's put names, so I'm not putting anyone on the spot. And I start commenting and telling them, I respond to the feedback. And I give them, in many cases, I will tell them, you know what, you're absolutely right. I'm going to start making that change. So this is a great strategy, and I do it in the middle of the semester and at the end of the semester. Okay, moving on to emotions. I've had a lot of reflections on emotions, and I guess it's not a surprise to you because pandemic has brought up and has made so evident a huge number of emotions. This is a book that I recommend. I think it's a game changer, Permission to Feel by Dr. Brackett. And it made me reflect on my own beliefs as an educator regarding emotions. So I asked myself, how do I think I should feel with my students? Should I show my emotions? Should I deal with emotions of students? Is this the job of just psychologists? Should I ignore it? We have a lot of beliefs about emotions. And I want to share with you a couple of key aspects that we should take into consideration. So the first is these 5 areas where emotions matter the most. And if you look at these 5 areas, they all concern our role as educators. But I want you to specifically focus on health and pandemic, mental health. So I want to talk a little bit about this. We know emotions affect our mental health, right? But what the pandemic did is that it led a lot of people to anxiety and depression. And there are a number of statistics and studies that came out last year that talk about this. These references I put here have to do actually with studies that have been done with growth mindset. So I won't go into them, but they're there if you want to check them out. Teaching about a growth mindset does have a positive effect on anxiety and depression. And so the big, the biggest reflection I've had is that mental health concerns all of us. Yeah, we're educators, we're not psychiatrists, we're not psychologists, but we're dealing with students, and we're dealing with colleagues, and we're dealing with family who have had an effect on their mental health because of the pandemic. So we can't ignore this, right? And what we can do is learn about it and change these beliefs that we have about emotions if they are not based on anything we've been learning, or studies, etc. And so this is something that impacted me. I actually didn't find a lot of data on Latin America, but what this this report by UNICEF says is that there are people or teenagers who recognize that they need help, but only 2 out of 5 ask for help. And I think this has to do a lot with how, as educators, we reflect our beliefs on emotions and how students can actually express their emotions to us. So 2 statistics in my close circle, and I want you to look at these 2 statistics. And I just want to say, I don't think it's only hitting close to home in my case. So if these are my statistics, and this is close circle, this is not people, acquaintances, it's probably hitting close to your home. So we need to get involved, and we need to learn, and we need to find strategies to include emotions and teaching about emotions or talking about emotions in our practices. So here I just took a couple of messages that my students have sent me. I had so many messages, only 4 could fit on my screen. But I'm sure this happened to you too. Students are writing about how they feel. Students are, they're stressed, they're feeling anxious. They've had family members die. And how are we dealing with this, So empathy is the key here. And putting ourselves in other people's shoes or rain boots is our responsibility as educators, because we deal with a lot of kids, a lot of teenagers, or a lot of adults, and ignoring their emotions because we think maybe that, it's about some people are empathetic and some people are not. I'm not empathetic and that's it. No, empathy can be learned, right? So connecting it to the growth mindset, if we understand that we can learn to be empathetic, then we can harness these skills. So empathy is connected to communication. And I also noticed that we don't really know how to communicate with each other. We're not good communicators. I read a couple of books, and I recommend them to you as well, on nonviolent communication, on apologizing, and phrases for growth mindset. And what I learned is that in a pandemic, when all this rainbow of emotions are going on and we're confronted with our both mindsets all the time, we tend to fail in how we communicate. So my recommendation, and something that I've been doing this past year, maybe 6 months, very consciously, is practicing mindful communication. And it is just basically, taking that message, breathing. Like, don't just answer it. Take a breath. Depending on what message they're sending your way, thank the person. Hi, thank you for writing to me. Validate what they're saying. I understand that that you're not feeling really well today, and give a response. But just these 3 steps can make a huge difference in the people we are communicating with. And finally, regarding self-care and growth, I just want to focus on 3 specific ideas. The first one is that mindfulness makes a difference. And the big confrontation I had with my own mindset was that I used to believe that this had nothing to do with me. And I wasn't the type of person that, could meditate or do mindful breathing, until I actually read about it and started learning what it was, instead of having misconceptions based on my fixed ideas of what I thought it was. And I do believe it makes a difference. A lot of educators now are talking about mindfulness. There's a lot of studies that support mindfulness. So I want to leave you with that idea of being more mindful and actually practicing mindfulness. The second idea is having a co-pilot. So imagine you're piloting a plane by yourself and you hit a thunderstorm like the pandemic. How are you going to pilot that plane if you don't have a co-pilot who's going to help you go get through it? And this applies for the pandemic, and applies for teaching, applies for life. We need a co-pilot. And Moore and Glasgow also talk about having a tribe, right? So we need to have tribes to move forward as educators, for example. So we shouldn't be doing things on our own, and the action we take depends a lot on that belief, whether we should or not do it on our own. And the third idea is that we need to keep working on our intellectual humility. We're always in academia. There's always competition, and you see a lot of growth and fixed, minds, more fixed, more growth, mixed, etc. And it's just important to keep in mind that we're in a state of being. We're in a state of becoming. We're always becoming better educators, and perfection should never be our objective. So just to finish my talk today, I know this has not been easy. And we are and we have been resilient, because we are here today in a conference about education in the middle of a pandemic, and, well, in the case of Colombia, in the middle of a very complex political and social situation. So just please stay strong. Let's continue confronting our own mindsets, and keep in mind that whether it rains or that it shines, it's about your state of mind. Thank you very much.